You must be some kind of therapist?
For this week's episode, I am borrowing a conversation I had with Dennison Joyce on his show Through the Looking Glass, originally on WIOX Radio. Dennison interviewed me about my program for parents, ROGD Repair, and the one-on-one work I do. He asked great questions and was a wonderful host. This conversation aired almost a year ago, and I've kept my copy of it on the back burner to share again on my podcast someday. And I'm bringing it to you today because we had a spot to fill. So hope you enjoy my conversation with Dennison Joyce, in which I share about my work.
You're working with ROGD Repair. Maybe you can explain what that is and what the trifecta of social contagion is that is really hitting our youth. And certainly I saw that in the DSM-5, 13 or 14 out of 100,000 children, I think that was written in 2013, were considered to be trans, and now it's like, I think in Massachusetts, 500 out of 100,000. So huge increase. And when these sort of epidemics happen in our health world, usually invokes an investigation. And it doesn't seem like there's an investigation now. It just seems like we know the problem, fast track, gender-affirming care. So maybe you can talk about your work and encapsulate these factors for us.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for asking. And you mentioned that the DSM-5 was released in 2013, and that's also the year that I graduated from my master's in counseling program. So I have had the bizarre privilege of growing my career as a therapist during that sort of decade of exponential growth in the number of young people identifying as trans, non-binary, or some other made-up so-called gender identity. And I was one of these young progressive therapists that was taught to affirm those identities. And as a result, I got to witness up close and personal so many of the underlying issues that now we talk about in the gender critical community, the autism, the endocrine disorders like polycystic ovarian syndrome, the history of sexual trauma and exposure to pornography, online grooming, and all of these issues. And it wasn't until I learned about detransitioners for the first time, which wasn't until 2020, 3 years after I was taught the gender affirming model, that I really gave myself the freedom to question all of this. And so fast forward now, it's 2025. And as you said, I have this program called ROGD Repair. And this is basically the result of having spent the last 5 years turning my career on its head to figure out what I, with my particular background and skills, can do to help with this issue because it's harming people. I was so disturbed when I understood the level of harm, real lasting physical harm, as well as psychological, being perpetuated by my own professional community. And a wise person in the gender critical community who reached out to me early in my sort of whistleblowing phase gave me the advice to focus essentially on what only I can do. That was how she'd sort of lived her life. Like, what can only I bring to the table? So part of that, as you mentioned, is the model of the trifecta of social contagion. This idea that gender identity ideology doesn't operate in isolation, but in a perfect storm, along with woke beliefs about social justice and cluster B personality traits. Now, some people like to misinterpret this to say that I am diagnosing everyone under the sun who identifies as trans with a cluster B personality disorder. No, that's not what I'm doing. But I am saying that even youths with sweet dispositions prior to all this, once they fall prey to the social contagion, begin developing some of these personality traits because they go hand in hand. The narcissism and entitlement, the black and white thinking, the histrionic attitude towards emotions, the idea that you can use threats of suicide to manipulate people into getting what you want, the emotional instability, the lack of perspective taking, all of that, and more. Those are the personality traits that we typically considered pathological in psychology until very, very recently. And those traits are being promulgated through social media and through what is being upheld now as a good, noble, correct, and righteous way to live. So it's the cluster B personality traits, enabling the incredibly rigid and radical ideology about social justice. And all of this works together with gender identity ideology. And together, that perfect storm, or that trifecta, I also like to think of it sort of like a mind virus that's been perfectly engineered to exploit the unique vulnerabilities of these young people. So their grandiosity, their insecurity, their rigidity, their insecurities. Um, and that's where it gets in. So then where does the name ROGD Repair come from? Well, it comes from looking at how you as a parent can plug those holes in your family system, because ultimately you can't change your child. Even if you have the benefit of time on your hands, even if your child is a minor, and let's say you live in a state that has increasingly good protections for minors, that's great. That's wonderful. But you cannot rely on the law or any system to protect you, because your kid will be 18 one day.
Mhm.
And you know what? Even if there's better laws in your state for people over 18, they can move. Ultimately, my battle is not the legal battle. I'm grateful there are people fighting that fight. It's not the fight that I was designed to fight. So until the people who are busy fighting the legal battles win, the rest of us have to figure out what we can do when it comes to the things we can control. And that's how we're communicating. That's how we're understanding ourselves and other people's psychology and relationships. So my program essentially teaches people to plug the holes that you can plug in your family system. If this is a mind virus that's perfectly engineered to get in through the cracks that were caused by something like a divorce
Mhm.
in your family, or a trauma that happened to your child, or a sibling dynamic, whatever those areas are, that's what you can control. That's what you can affect. And it also, yeah, it's about working on yourself. It's about understanding adolescent psychology as well, and understanding the psychology of the trans cult, if you don't mind my saying that, so that you can approach things in a way that is not likely to backfire. And so the first stage of my work with a lot of families is just the disaster remediation phase of, inventorying everything that, they would have done differently, hindsight being 2020. I teach people not to make those common mistakes. I teach people how to clean up the mistakes they've already made, and again, how to affect the things that are truly within their power to affect.
Now, in your trifecta, you have cluster B personalities, and you mentioned some of the traits, the insecurity, loneliness. Can you explain a few more of those traits that generally are there, but not always, of course?
Sure. So when we talk about cluster B personality traits, the cluster B personality disorders are narcissistic, antisocial, histrionic, and borderline. So some of those terms are familiar to most people. We all know narcissism. It's
Hmm.
pretty big in pop psychology. Borderline personality disorder is also something that a lot of people are talking about. Histrionic maybe doesn't get mentioned quite as much in the pop psychology. I think there's a reason for that, which is that a lot of social media behavior in the very same channels that love to grab onto pop psychology concepts, a lot of the behavior in those channels is histrionic. So these grandiose, superficial displays of emotion and attention seeking and overly sexualized, overly intimate behavior, that's, part of the pattern we associate with histrionic personality disorder. Antisocial has to do with essentially getting one's thrills out of lying, cheating, and stealing. Now, to diagnose a personality disorder, that's not what we're doing here, right? It takes a lot for someone who's been appointed a mental health professional in charge of a certain situation to diagnose a personality disorder, because there has to be a pervasive pattern of interpersonal behavior that's extremely problematic to reach that level. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, the traits of these disorders are part of the trifecta of social contagion.
Right.
So
Okay.
with narcissism, we look at the entitlement factor. For instance, with borderline personality disorder, we're looking at a lack of a sense of self and emptiness and instability in relationships. And, whenever we start explaining these traits, anyone who has experience dealing with someone who's in the trans cult can look around and see how those traits are manifesting here.
Gotcha. Now, also there's the social justice narrative as part of the trifecta. You see that as more sort of the advocacy from above. Is that what it is? That these people have not been recognized in the past, and thank God we're shining a light on this condition that people have had to suppress for so long. Is that what it is? You're assigned a gender at birth, but it might not be your real gender. Is that the
You're
social
getting
justice?
at the narrative component of
Okay,
things, right?
okay.
So, and a lot of these youth, by the way, are extremely intellectual. You know, they're the gifted, quirky kids. Some of them are on the autism spectrum, and they love to intellectualize. And many of them come from very intellectual families. A lot of the people I work with are brilliant. Common misperception about my work, by the way, is that you know need to be educated because you're not that smart or you don't understand psychology, and that's why you come to me. No, I work with extremely brilliant people.
Mm-hmm.
I work with people at all levels intellectually and in terms of their understanding of psychology. I've worked with therapists, and doctors and engineers, but this stuff is really tricky, and that's
Mm-hmm.
why we need help with it, right? So it's sometimes the intellectual families, because they're so intellectual themselves, are the ones most likely to get sucked in to these logical headbutting battles with their kids and miss some of the indicators of what's going on underneath the surface emotionally. So the social justice narratives, that's what's empowering intellectually some of the bad ideas and the toxic emotional traits.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. And then the third one, gender identity ideology, which is sort of the new piece, I think, it's been devised over the last decade and a half or so that basically you're trapped and we've got the way out for you. We can transition you to the opposite gender. That's essentially what it's about. And there's no kind of leeway there. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I mean, this ideology has roots a century old, and that's where we have the excellent work of people like Helen Joyce, who've written books like Trans, exposing where this came from. But it's so prevalent now. Now it's reached the level that the narrative is that you are assigned a sex at birth, and the doctor has no idea what they're doing when they do that. They're just making a rough guess based on the thing between your legs, but that's actually bigotry for them to judge you based on your genitalia. And the ideology just goes from there. You don't need to hear me
Right,
say.
right. So it's I would imagine, very difficult for a therapist to try to speak freely when that general narrative is taking place. If you go against that flow of, well, you have thoughts that you might be the other gender, well, quick, we got to get you into care, and care means procedures, medication, bottom surgery potentially. And it seems like when there's consensus for that, and it's consensus around science, we saw with COVID, can be troublesome.
Well, and that's why so many therapists, the exact therapist that you'd most want your kid to be seeing in this situation, those therapists are not even working with anyone remotely dealing with this issue because of the expectations that patients are bringing into therapy, and combined with the highly litigious environment and the myths of regarding conversion therapy that are being spread. This idea that anyone who's trying to help young people come into congruence and acceptance with their sex body is trying to convert them, and that this is an abusive and ineffective practice. So those narratives certainly aren't helping. It is really hard to find a good therapist that is willing to address this issue holistically.
Yeah. So especially when you have DM5 defining gender dysphoria as psychological distress that arises from a mismatch between the person's experience or expressed gender and their sex-assigned gender at birth. Diagnosis helps individuals access the health care and treatment necessary to focusing on the distress rather than labeling gender as a disorder, identity as a disorder. So it sounds like the medical community is all for this. Like, you've got to get the treatments, and there's no examination of other possibilities. Is that kind of the
To be
case?
fair, there's definitely a false manufactured consensus because when you start digging into this issue and talking to other professionals, you realize that there have been people in every relevant professional sphere who have been trying to push back on this. There are people in the community, mental health professionals. I'm just one. Some have bigger presences than mine publicly, and some are doing quieter work behind the scenes. Um, in the communities of endocrinologists, you have doctors like William Malone blowing the whistle, and pediatricians, you have doctors like Julia Mason blowing the whistle. And in our documentary, No Way Back, The Reality of Gender-Affirming Care, Julia Mason explains what happened when she and other pediatricians tried to raise this issue. It was one of the most popular issues in the forums, demanding a review of the literature on the subject, and it got squelched by the Pediatric Association. I forget, AP, AAP, I
AA,
think. Yeah,
AAP, yeah.
I get all the organizations
I
mixed up,
know.
all the acronyms, but yeah, I mean, they silenced the dissent. They actually changed the process by which doctors are allowed to bring up issues in those forums in order to silence dissent. So it's a manufactured consensus.
Mhm. So it must have political roots that are pretty powerful too, because the insurance is covering this now. I know when my mother needed a pacemaker, we found her twice on the floor, barely breathing before they would say, okay, the insurance will cover it.
Yeah.
And for this, it's like, no problem, insurance has got it. So there's some kind of power or movement from above, almost like I don't know, some of the other movements we've seen, Me Too, where it doesn't seem to be as grassroots or BLM. It's much more AstroTurf, corporate money. Um, is this a profitable industry? What's driving this funding and
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to questions like that, my stance is always like, I'm just one blind man feeling the elephant, and I can tell you what it feels like from over here, but I don't know the shape of the whole elephant. There
right,
are
right.
other people who've dove much deeper than I have into that, but it definitely feels like a sinister agenda, and there are some very wealthy and powerful, frankly, narcissistic, autogynephilic males at, you know, trying to run things from a position of power for sure. I don't know. I don't
Mm.
know all the details there.
Okay, so when you do your work, ROGD Repair, parents come to you from all over the country.
All
And
over the world, actually.
so how do they approach you? How do they find you? And what's that process like for people?
Well, so my career's just kind of snowballed. Now I don't see any patients anymore right
Hmm.
now. I retain my license as a marriage and family therapist. Partly, if nothing else, just to maintain the authority that that gives me to say I am an LMFT and I declare that this is wrong until they come and take my license from me, which they've tried and failed before.
Thankfully.
But I mean, I went from being just a therapist to a therapist and a public figure to a therapist, a public figure, and a consultant because I decided to start just seeing what people wanted to talk to me about, who were approaching me from different situations.
Hmm.
And then I stopped doing therapy a little over a year ago just to focus on this issue, given my limited bandwidth.
Hmm.
And and so now I coach parents from all over the world, and pulling back on therapy gave me the space to not only focus on this issue, but put all the core themes and lessons that I've learned from doing this work with families into the program ROGD Repair, which now anyone can sign up for. So my work is essentially twofold in that regard, where I have my individual and couples that I do coaching with, and they can find me from anywhere in the world as long as they speak English. So most of my clients are in the U.S., but I have some in Canada, some in Great Britain, and Australia. Um, and usually they'll just click on my Calendly link through my bio site on my social media or through the notes in my show notes on my podcast. You must
Hmm.
be some kind of therapist. And just a lot of people will book like a free discovery call, which I'm not doing right now because I'm about to go on vacation, or they'll just kind of go ahead and pay for a full consultation because they're feeling like desperate to dive in, and maybe they've listened to enough of my podcast to know that I'm there for helping people like them. Or they find my course at rogdrepair.com,
Right.
and and then they might work with me one-on-one in addition to that. What was your question? Just how do they find me?
Yeah, how do they find you, and then where do you go from there once they come to you? You recommend the course? Do you recommend counseling?
I always recommend the course, and honestly, I need to revise my process because I need to make it very clear. Like, I don't want to work with you if you're not willing to do the course, as
Mhm.
if this, like, because you're making me repeat myself because I've already said certain things in the course. You can do it on your own time, but the best combination is to do the course and work with me one on one. So yeah, I always recommend the course, and then in terms of the coaching work I do, it's and thank you for inviting me to articulate my process because I actually need to be able to um, kind of put this into like a FAQ or something soon. Um, and so I meet with ideally mom and dad. So best case scenario, there's a healthy, strong marriage there. But sometimes they're not married or they're not on the same page about this issue, or they're maybe one person's a lot more invested in doing something like getting help. So sometimes I'll meet with one parent or the other. I also love it if we can involve other family members. So sometimes there's a special grandparent that has a really close relationship with the kid that we're worried about, or an older sibling that is worried about them. So if we have other family members who are also concerned, I really like to include them in the process. And um, the family tells me about their kid, and over the course of typically several hours together, they paint essentially a picture in my mind of who this young person is, their personality, what makes them tick, their psychological defenses, their common reactions to things, their motives, their feelings, their relationships. I get this picture in my mind, and then we look at what the family can affect. Because, like I said, um, I say to religious families, God gave your child free will, right? Your child has free will. And in some cases, they're already an adult. In some cases, they're already medicalizing by the time the family comes to me. And I will tell them if it's not the ideal time for an intervention, I'll still always work with people, almost always work with people on turning over every stone we can turn over. And I'm approaching this from a standpoint of, how do we reduce the total amount of damage that is done to this person in the course of their lifetime? How do we, add years back onto their lives by playing our cards in such a way that they're likely to, get off the hormone sooner rather than later. So I do kind of approach things from a harm reduction standpoint. But I'll let people know if it's like a really dangerous time, for example, is like kid just turned 18 and immediately went on hormones. Now, like 2 months in, they're feeling on top of the world. This is a very hard time to intervene. So I'll let people know what I'm hearing in terms of what's working for them and against them.
Mhm.
I will tell them what they're doing wrong, and it's no judgment on you as a person or you as a parent, but it's to say, look, you want to be effective. Here's the nature of the beast you're dealing with, and here are
Mhm.
the rules of the game for engaging with that beast. Here are the mistakes you made in that game.
Now, in terms of mistakes, are most parents, do they hope to ignore it and it'll go away? Are they
That's one.
That's one. Are they authoritative? You are not trans. This is crazy. Snap out of it.
That can be another.
Are they enablers? Like, okay, if you're trans, let's go. We're with
That's a
you.
third. Yep. Keep going
What,
down the list.
um, what else do you have? So those were the three that came to me.
Um, Here's one that might surprise you. Trying to show your kid detransition videos. So a lot of people think detransitioners are going to be the way to get through to your kids about this. And I do always say, take my advice with a grain of salt. Nobody knows your kid better than you. If there's a reason that you think an intervention that I think is ill-advised might be effective, I'm all ears. And, there's for everything I say, there's a time that the opposite is probably more advisable. That being said, I have some general rules of thumb. One of them is don't be overly hopeful that talking to your kids about detransitioners or showing them detrans videos is going to be effective. And I'm just reminded of that because it happened again today.
Hmm?
A family, lovely people, by the way, no shade on them, great, wonderful people. But they had the same naive hope that every parent has that, oh, just learning about detransitioners. And there was an opening with their kid where their kid told them to go learn about detransitioners. So, okay, we're thinking, great, we'll take that opening. Your kid said you should go learn about detransitioners. So now we're going to circle back and say, wow, you told me to learn about detransitioners and I did. And wow, I'm so shocked. And, so we talked about how to sort of use that to their advantage,
Hmm.
but then they really wanted to show their kid detrans videos. And I explained why we don't do that in the ROGD repair approach. But I always say, God gives you free will too. And, who's to say you should listen to me? Maybe I'm wrong, right?
Right.
So, uh, against my advice, they did proceed with trying to watch a detransitioner video with their child, and here's the reaction they got. Daughter immediately explained all the reasons that she is different from the girl in the video.
Of course.
Of course, right? So this is where your kid's going to meet you logically, intellectually, rationally with it is, oh, I'm different because blah 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 blah, right? Well, what's the underlying motivation here? The motivation is I have a fragile ego. I have latched onto this idea of being trans as something that gives me comfort and like a shield to navigate the world. It makes me feel powerful. And the last thing I want to do is identify myself with someone remorseful and ashamed who's saying I made a huge mistake. That is the last thing in the world a trans identified young person at this stage with their ego development
Right.
is, their motivation going into watching something like that is to get intellectual about how many ways can I count the differences between myself and this person so I can explain why they're not like me.
Interesting.
And you want your kid to see themselves in this person. It's not going to happen. So that's a common mistake.
Got you. So the film No Way Back, you wouldn't recommend necessarily for the
No, and I mean,
children.
again, everyone's different, I'll be 10, 20 meetings into a family and we'll go over why specifically they think that that film might land with their kid because there's an opening or because of a, particular series of events that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the sort of customization comes in. And in my program, ROGD Repair, which is a self-paced course, you don't have to hire me as a consultant to do the course.
Great.
Part of how I have people customize the material is I'll have a lesson where I'm giving a talk and there's some written parts, and then there'll be a Q&A for you to reflect on how does this apply to you. So it'll be, if I were to say this to my child, how would she respond? That's, where I try to approximate the coaching process by getting people to think about the specifics of how their child reacts to things.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Now, so interesting hearing you speak about this. It's really fascinating. What about when the parents aren't on the same page? You're almost doing marriage counseling before you can do this counseling with ROGD repair. That must be incredibly difficult for
And
the couple as well.
I'm so clear in my boundaries that with this coaching work, I'm here to talk to people who are on our side of this issue. Like, I'm not here to convert anyone.
Okay.
I'm not here to convince you about it. When you're ready to learn, if you've been affirming and now you're questioning that and you're open to learning, fine. But yeah, I mean, it depends on when you say they're not on the same page. I don't work with people where one believes that affirming is the right approach. I definitely work with people where they're both concerned, but they have different ways of thinking that they should go about it. Families where maybe dad is less worried than mom and thinks they should be more lax and more compromising. So, like, here's a common scenario. Children often have conflict with the same-sex parent, and that same-sex parent is their role model. That's probably, if you're a young woman and you're in conflict with your mom, she looks a lot like you're going to look as an adult. She has a lot of your same traits. She's the woman who raised you. So your conflict with your mom as a young woman is a big part of this sort of trans identity. And so there's already, let's say, more scapegoating, triangulation, bad cop dynamic in the mother-daughter relationship. And mom's the one holding the line saying, we cannot affirm, we have to keep using she, her pronouns. We can't endorse this. No, we're drawing the line at the binder. We're drawing the line at this and that, right? And dad's saying, well, I just think, in order to preserve the relationship, we can kind of compromise on calling her
Gotcha.
they, or we can let her bind like 8 hours a day, but not 16. Or, dad might have this idea But if they end up triangulated in that rather than acting as a unified team, then that particular triangulation is only exacerbating the mother-daughter conflict because mom is bad cop and dad is good cop. And, now daughter's unconscious association is mom's no fun. I want to identify with my male role model.
Right.
So absolutely there is sort of a like family therapy element to things, although again, I'm very clear this is coaching. I'm providing educational guidance. I'm not diagnosing or treating mental illness.
Now, it seems like, are there more girls than boys transitioning these days? I thought it used to be more girls transitioning, but now I hear there's a rise in boys transitioning.
Yeah, again, like I can only feel my little corner of the elephant,
Mm-hmm.
but from what it looks like from here, yeah, the narrative certainly 5 years ago, whenever like irreversible damage came out, certainly the narrative and the numbers were showing, this is 80% girls to 20% boys. And that was part of what was used in the justification for why we're taking such a critical look at this, because historically gender dysphoria was prevalent since early childhood and primarily males. But what we're seeing now, at least again from my corner of the elephant, a lot of college age males kind of lagging behind the females, following in their footsteps.
Mm. Now, is porn connected to this at all
Absolutely.
okay. Um,
Yeah. Where were
I've
you
just,
going with that?
well, I've just heard porn is so destructive sexually, especially for boys in so many different ways, whether it's just they don't attach to girls in any way at all, or also the roles are such that, a lot of guys are afraid to look at a girl they feel attracted to because it could be conceived as harassment. And so it seems like a lot of the teenage boys I work with or know are kind of just shutting off from dating. And maybe this porn avenue takes them there. I know it can take them to a lot of places. So,
Yeah, it's such a major factor. I had a detransitioner on my podcast, Shane Cole, who has been very open about his history of addiction to hypnosis porn. And I asked him, what percent of ROGD boys is this relevant to? He said 99%. And, that's what I would guess too. But hearing that from a male who's been there, done that,
mm,
um, it's I always tell parents who don't know this yet, like, this is the Occam's razor explanation. This is especially with a lot of the behavior in the males that feels really incoherent. The males who have always been very male typical in their interests and personality, the males who are heterosexual, and as well some of the sexual flipping that goes on for some of them, because we have a lot now of these boys where all signs until recently point to them being straight, and now they are trans identified and they have a trans identified boyfriend and they're pretending to be lesbians together. And the nature of those sexual relationships, from all the clues that we can get from an outside perspective, is very much like it looks like parallel play, kind of mutual masturbation. Um, it doesn't look like a full-blown, passionate, intimate relationship, but that's how warped these kids have gotten through getting almost all of their sexual experiences through very twisted forms of pornography and masturbation, oftentimes combined with having an online gaming addiction. So the idea of sort of parallel play, each being in their own universe, giving themselves pleasure, that's kind of all they know of sexuality. And then they end up in these like quasi-sexual relationships with other boys who are also presenting and calling themselves girls and maybe taking estrogen. And yeah, they never really get to experience all the feelings and realities that come with having actual attraction to girls and pursuing that. And it's very sad because
oh boy.
these are their formative experiences.
Stephanie, we have about a minute and a half left, so I was hoping you could, say anything that we haven't talked about you think parents need to hear. And then again, you can mention how they find your work and your podcast, as I mentioned earlier, Some Therapists. Absolutely fabulous.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, this is just going to be blatant self-promotion, but the number one thing I hear is, I wish I'd had these tools sooner. I had a parent schedule a free discovery call with me a few weeks ago who she described how her son in his late 20s was now dating a trans identified person and all these other changes in his personality. And I said, well, are you worried that he's going to announce he's trans soon? And she says, well, he hasn't, so no. And I thought,
Mm.
oh, like I see the writing on the wall. And, it's whenever people aren't in that place of feeling like it's a dire emergency, they're hesitant to invest in really doing the work and paying the money for the help. But it's really, if you listen to parents further down this path, they will always tell you, I wish that I'd had these tools sooner. So if you think this is a worry for your kid, by all means pursue it. And I've had a lot of people go through the course and say this would be great preventative knowledge. So
Mm.
yeah, blatant self-promotion, but it's true. It's based on experience. And especially because the early phase of working with a new couple is usually finding out all the things that they wish they'd done differently. So you
Right.
can avoid making those mistakes if you get on it early enough.
Wow. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Win, ROGD Repair. You have a great course for folks. Are you on Twitter as well?
I'm on X at some therapist. My account is currently locked. You can request to follow me, and if I like your bio, I might
Okay.
accept. And we didn't discuss a coupon code specifically for your listeners. We didn't plan for that, but I will give them my coupon code. They can use Some Therapist 2025 to take half off their first month at rogdrepair.com.
Oh, fantastic. Stephanie, thank you so much again. And just the work you're doing is so important and brave of you to go this route. But I know you're following your heart and your conscience. You want to help people. So
Thank you so much for having me on, Dennison. It's been a pleasure.
All the best. Take care.
Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.